On the open ocean, the greatest danger isn't the water below. It's the person right next door. These 3 true cruise ship horror stories are based on real events that happened to a brother, a pair of best friends, and 2 co-workers, proving that sometimes there is no escape. First, a young woman on a family vacation vanishes from her cabin, and the last person to see her alive tells a story that doesn't add up. Next, a couple is forced to listen through their cabin wall as a violent argument next door ends in a sudden, terrifying silence. And finally, a crew member disappears after being seen on security footage, leaving behind only 2 perfectly placed items and an impossible official explanation. A cruise ship isn't a floating city. It's a cage with no key, where the sound of the ocean isn't freedom. It's the sound of evidence being washed away forever. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming for you. You wake up. You go to sleep. You have a sister, then you don't. That's what it boiled down to for Foster. One morning, he was on a cruise ship with his family, and by lunch, his sister Maggie was gone. He stood on their cabin balcony, the salt air cold on his face, trying to make sense of a world that had just broken in 2. There was no big speech, no warning, just a simple, brutal fact. She was there, and now she wasn't. Dinner the night before had been loud in the best way. The ship's main dining room was a universe of clinking glasses and the low chatter of 100 different conversations. At their table, though, the only thing that mattered was Maggie's story about getting lost on a shore excursion in Mexico. She waved her fork around as she described arguing with a taxi driver in broken Spanish, her eyes wide and sparkling with mischief. She had a way of turning a frustrating moment into a hilarious adventure, and the whole family was laughing, tears in their eyes. The memory was so clear, so real. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, the kind you don't realize is important until it's gone forever. Later, they walked the upper decks, the night air warm and breezy. The ship was alive with lights and music, a floating city on a calm black sea. Foster remembered leaning on the rail with Maggie, just looking out at the endless darkness. They talked about nothing and everything, the way siblings do. She pointed out a distant blinking light from another ship, a tiny spark of life miles away. During their walk, she struck up a conversation with a young crew member named Casper. He was a server, polite and friendly, with a quick smile. They chatted for a few minutes about his home country. It was a simple, forgettable interaction, just another friendly face on a ship full of them. The quiet of the cabin was a welcome feeling that night. A full day of sun and a good meal left everyone tired and content. The gentle rocking of the ship was a cradle, the steady rush of the air conditioning a peaceful, constant sound. It was the kind of deep, easy sleep you only get on vacation, a sleep with no worries, a sleep where you're sure that tomorrow will be just as good as today. For Foster, it was the last good night's sleep he would ever have. He woke up slowly, the morning sun just starting to warm the room. The cabin was quiet. He figured Maggie, an early riser, had probably gone up to the buffet to grab them a table for breakfast. He got up, stretched, and started going through the motions of any other vacation morning. He pulled on a shirt and shorts, already thinking about what they'd do when the ship docked in a few hours. He wasn't worried. There was no reason to be. On a cruise ship, everyone is safe, and everything is on a schedule. Foster left the cabin and headed for the ship's large buffet restaurant on one of the upper decks. He walked past rows of tables, scanning the crowd for his sister's familiar face. She wasn't there. He thought maybe she'd gone to save them some chairs by the pool instead. He walked out onto the Lido deck. The air was already getting warm, and the sound of crew members cleaning and arranging deck chairs filled the morning. He walked the entire length of the pool area. No Maggie. A small, quiet thought entered his mind then. Not panic, just a simple question. Where could she be? He turned around and headed back toward the cabin, figuring their paths had just crossed. He walked down the long, identical hallways of the passenger decks. When he got back to the room, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt empty. He looked around the small space, and that's when he saw it. On the little table by the door sat her passport and her wallet. That's when the real panic hit. It was a cold, electric shock that went right through him. She would never, ever go anywhere without her wallet, not even to the pool. It was the one hard fact that broke through all the easy explanations. The knot in his stomach tightened into a sickening lurch that made the whole room feel like it was tilting. He yelled her name into the empty cabin. The word sounded small, useless. He ran back out to the balcony, shouting into the morning air, "Maggie! Maggie!" His voice was frantic, swallowed by the vastness of the sky and water. All he got back was the sound of his own ragged breathing. You see things in movies, and you think that's how it works. For Foster and his family, there was just polite disbelief. The ship's security manager listened to their story with a practiced plastic smile. "She's probably just exploring, sir," he said. "We'll have her back in time for lunch." An announcement was made, a calm voice asking passengers to report if they'd seen Maggie. The ship, a floating city, just kept moving. Faint laughter drifted from the upper decks. It was a bizarre and cruel sound. The security team interviewed Casper, the friendly server from the night before. Foster watched the video later. Casper's voice was too calm. He never looked at the security officer questioning him. He was unnaturally still, as he told them he had never seen Maggie in his life. The ship's security cleared him almost immediately, but Foster couldn't shake it. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a lie. The official search found nothing. The ship pulled into port in Jamaica. A company official informed them they had to disembark. They had to leave the ship. They had to leave their sister behind. Standing on the busy dock, the hot air thick with the smell of salt and diesel, Foster felt the sickening feeling of being dismissed. They were stranded, a family erased by a corporation. Years passed. The world moved on. They made a MySpace page, a sad digital memorial. The internet wasn't a comfort. It was an abyss. Anonymous tips would come in, like a man who messaged them, embarrassed, saying he thought he saw her picture on an adult website. They could never confirm it. It was just another ghost. The idea of human trafficking became the only story that made any sense, but it was a story with no proof and no ending. They put up a large reward. It still sits in a bank account today, untouched. And so Foster is still on that balcony. He can close his eyes and be right back there, feeling the cold air, hearing the water move against the ship. The sound of the ocean used to be the sound of peace. Now it's the sound of a question. It's the sound of a door slamming shut. It's the last thing he ever heard before his world fell apart, and it's a sound that will follow him for the rest of his life. Blood was the last thing Diana expected to see on a cruise ship. Her husband, David, stood beside her on their balcony as they watched the crew section off the cabin next to theirs. A small light on an officer's radio blinked in the early morning haze. Down below, on the clean white cover of a lifeboat, a dark red smear stood out. It looked completely wrong, like a stain that should have been washed away by the sea spray, but there it was. An officer was talking to the wife from the cabin next door, Shelley. Her face was a blank mask. From their balcony, just a few feet away, Diana could hear the low murmur of their voices, but the words didn't make sense. Shelley's husband, Bernard, was gone. It had all started so differently. A week earlier, all four of them had boarded the massive ship in Fort Lauderdale, laughing. They had been best friends for 5 years, ever since they all met in college. This trip was something they had been planning for months, a joint anniversary celebration. David had found a package deal online, and it just seemed perfect, a way for all of them to escape and relive the easy fun of their college days. The first 2 days were a blur of bright sun and blue water, exactly like they had imagined. The ship was a floating city, and they explored every inch of it together. They ate together in the grand dining hall, did the silly trivia games by the pool, and one night, after too many colorful drinks, they took over the karaoke bar. Diana remembered watching Bernard, a quiet guy by nature, get pulled onto the stage by a beaming Shelley. He was a terrible singer, but he sang his heart out just for her. It was just like old times, and watching them, Diana felt a sense of relief. It seemed like all the stress from back home had melted away, and they were the same happy couple she and David had always known. Their conversations were easy back then, full of shared memories and inside jokes. On the second night, they all stood together on the top deck, leaning against the railing and watching the ship cut a path through the dark water. The sky was so full of stars, and the air was warm and salty. Bernard pointed out a satellite gliding silently across the heavens. For a moment, with the sound of the ship's party fading into the background, there was just a perfect, peaceful quiet between the four of them. It was a memory Diana would later cling to, a snapshot of how things were supposed to be. It was the last time she would see her best friends look truly happy. Things started to get a different kind of quiet around day 3. That's when the little cracks began to show. They were docked in Belize, and Diana could hear them arguing through the wall as they got ready. It was about little things, what to do for the day, how much things cost. But hearing it from your best friends felt different. It wasn't just noise, it was personal. On a ship, there's nowhere for that bad energy to go. It just stays with you, trapped in the recycled air of the hallways. That night at dinner, the silence between Bernard and Shelley was louder than the silverware hitting the plates. It was the kind of sharp, angry sound of a knife scraping porcelain that makes you look down at your own food. Diana and David tried to fill the space, to smooth things over, but it was useless. They were just putting a bandage on a deep wound. By the time the ship reached Grand Cayman, the mood was thick enough to choke on. It was easier for Diana and David to just give them space. It beat sitting through another meal, watching their friends pretend not to hate each other. Their own anniversary trip was starting to feel like they were just spectators at a slow-motion disaster. Diana would be in their cabin, this small, suffocating little box, and the sounds would just bleed right through the wall. Not just voices, but the angry way a drawer would slam shut, or the hard clink of a wine glass being put down on the counter. Every sound was an exclamation point. The last full day at sea was gala night. Everyone was dressed up, forcing the fun. Diana saw them across the dining hall. Shelley wore a beautiful dress, and Bernard was in a suit. They smiled for a picture, but the smiles were all teeth. The two couples ate at opposite ends of the room. Later that night, back in the cabin, the real trouble started. It began low, a frustrated murmur from their room. Then the voices got louder, raised. It felt like it was about everything and nothing all at once. Years of little annoyances boiling over in that tiny space. David and Diana just laid there in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Diana glanced at the red numbers on their bedside clock. 3:27 a.m. The shouting next door was still going. You feel like you should do something, bang on the wall, anything. But you don't. What can you say to your best friend in the middle of a fight like that? The shouting got worse, raw and cracking with emotion. Diana heard their balcony door slide open with a screech. The argument moved outside, into the damp sea air. His voice, hoarse, hers, shrill. It was a hurricane of words, a furious storm of anger raging right next to them. David put a pillow over his head. Diana couldn't, she just listened, frozen. Then it just stopped. A sudden, absolute silence that was more terrifying than all the shouting. In that quiet, she held her breath. Her heart was pounding in her ears. David sat up in bed. They stared at the wall that separated their rooms. Then they heard it. A distinct, ugly scrape of metal on metal. It was followed by a solid, sickening thump. It wasn't a splash. It was a heavy, final sound. Then, nothing. Just the deep rush of the ocean against the ship. David and Diana stared at each other in the dark. A minute passed, then another. The silence from next door was absolute. What could they do? Call security. About what? A noise. They did nothing. Sleep didn't come. They just lay there, listening to the quiet, until the first gray light of dawn. The next morning, after a tense and sleepless night, a knock on their door made them both jump. It was Shelley. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wide with panic. "Have you seen Bernard?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We had a fight last night, a stupid one. He went to walk it off and he never came back. I thought he'd be here, or I don't know where he is." Her franticness felt real. David went with her to alert the crew. Diana stayed behind, her stomach in knots. A few minutes later, she heard Shelley's voice again from the hallway, this time raised in a shriek. Diana stepped out of her cabin and saw it. A steward was pointing at the railing of Shelley's balcony, at the blood. That's when the ship's celebratory atmosphere shattered. The first people to respond weren't cops, but the ship's own security team in their crisp white uniforms. They were professional and serious, immediately securing the cabin with tape. The captain was notified, and an announcement came over the ship's intercom telling all passengers that due to an onboard incident, access to that hallway was restricted. The party was officially over. The final day at sea was a strange, tense journey back to Florida. There were no police to call out in the middle of the ocean. The ship itself became a holding cell, a floating crime scene under the sole authority of the captain. Ship security questioned Diana and David, taking their initial statements. They questioned Shelley for hours. Rumors spread through the other passengers like a virus. By the time the coast of Fort Lauderdale was visible on the horizon, the mood on the ship was grim. As they pulled into port, Diana could see them waiting on the dock. First, the local police came aboard, big city cops who looked out of place against the cruise ship's cheerful decor. They took over the scene from the ship's security. But then, a short while later, another group came on. Men in dark suits, the FBI. Because Bernard was an American citizen who went missing in international waters, it was their case now. The investigation officially began, but it felt like it was already over. The local cops handed over their notes and the FBI re-questioned everyone. Diana told her story again, about the argument, the time on the clock, the terrible sounds. She watched them take Shelley off the ship for more questioning. The case eventually went cold, officially classified as a man lost at sea. Bernard's family never believed it. They were sure Shelley was involved, that maybe someone on the ship even helped her. But they had no proof. For Diana, the vacation was a permanent haunting memory, a story she would tell in quiet rooms for the rest of her life. The unsettling truth that stuck with her wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about knowing you can be just a few feet away, on the other side of a thin metal wall, while your best friend's life comes to an end, and have no idea of the real horror that's about to happen. You learn to live with the noise on a ship. For the thousands of passengers on the upper decks, it's the sound of vacation, an endless loop of pop music, the splash from the pools, the dinging of slot machines. It's the sound of escape. For the crew, the sound is different. Down in the crew decks, below the waterline, it's the sound of the factory floor, a deep, constant resonance from the engines that you feel in your teeth. The world down there is a maze of narrow, sterile white corridors with low ceilings that make you feel like you're always ducking. The lights are always on, a harsh, fluorescent glare that knows no difference between day and night. The air has a constant cold hiss from the ventilation systems, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and cooking oil. This was Fabian's world. His life was measured in 7-month contracts, a ghost in the machine that powered the fantasy happening on the decks above. It was the summer of 2013, and his friend and work partner, Karina, was his anchor in that world. She was from the UK, and like him, she was assigned to the kids' daycare, starting on the same contract for a season of cruises running out of a port on the West Coast. They had a pact to meet in the crew mess for coffee 10 minutes before every shift. The mess hall was a large, windowless room that always smelled of industrial coffee and whatever was steaming in the stainless steel buffet trays. It was the only place crew from every department mixed, a loud sea of different languages and grievances. They'd find a small table in the corner, a temporary island of calm. Kid threw a blue crayon in the ball pit again, Fabian said one morning, the words barely audible over the chatter. Took me 20 minutes to find it. I think my knees are permanently bruised from crawling around in there. Karina laughed, a real laugh that cut through the noise of the room. Let me guess, the one in the blue polo shirt? He's a menace. His parents just point him at the door and disappear for 8 hours. She took a sip of her tea, her one small protest against the terrible coffee. Still, it's better than the glitter incident of last voyage. Fabian visibly winced at the memory. We do not speak of the glitter incident. I swear, I still have some in my left ear. I'll be 80 years old, and they'll find a piece of purple glitter lodged in my brain. That was them. Easy, simple. They talked about work, about their families back home, about how strange it was to live in a floating city where they were completely invisible. They were background characters in thousands of vacation photos, their faces blurred and unimportant. Down here, they were just people, counting the days until the end of their contracts, trying to get through another long day. Life on the ship was a relentless rhythm. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. On their breaks, if they were lucky enough to get one at the same time, they'd sometimes find a small, crew-only deck at the ship's stern. It was a tiny metal platform, usually vibrating from the engines, but it was their only real escape. They'd stand in the sea spray, watching the churning white water of the ship's wake stretch for miles behind them, the only evidence that they were actually moving. It was the only place that felt real, the only place where the noise of the machine was replaced by the roar of the ocean. Most times they didn't even talk. They just stood there in a shared, unspoken understanding that this little ritual was what kept them sane. The turning point of the voyage, the moment everything broke, began with the most normal event imaginable. At the end of a long, exhausting shift, they clocked out. Fabian was heading to his bunk, and Karina was heading to the crew lounge to read. He gave a quick nod. She gave a tired smile. "See you in the morning," she said. The next morning, Fabian stood alone at their table in the crew mess, a cup of coffee in his hand. He waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Karina was never late. He called her bunk. No answer. A small, cold knot began to tighten in his stomach. He made the call to their supervisor. That's when the rhythm of the ship stopped. The search began quietly. At first, it was just a few crew members checking the common areas, their voices calm and professional over the radios. But as the hours passed, the search grew. The calm voices became more strained. Fabian was part of it, assigned a grid on Deck 4. He walked through corridors he'd walked 1,000 times, but now they felt different, alien. Every closed door seemed to hide something. The familiar hiss of the ventilation that was once just background noise now felt oppressive, like the ship itself was holding its breath. Then they checked the security footage. They showed him the tape in a small, windowless security office. It was from a crew corridor, 4:30 in the morning. And there she was, holding a ship phone to her ear, but she was the only one talking. Her face was a wreck, a mix of pure fear and awful desperation, like she was pleading with someone who wasn't there. Then she walked out of the camera's view into a part of the ship she had no business being in. Hours later, they found her things. In a restricted maintenance area, a place of bare steel and exposed pipes, just sitting on the cold deck. Her laptop and a pair of sneakers. The detail he couldn't shake, the image that was burned into his mind, was the sheer neatness of it. They were placed just so, perfectly still. Not dropped, not thrown, placed, like a prop on a stage. As if she had simply stepped out of them and vanished into thin air. The official story came out a day later. A rogue wave. It was garbage. The ocean had been calm all night. It was a lie to keep the passengers calm. For the first time, Fabian understood that the ship wasn't just a ship. It was a machine, and a missing part was less important than keeping the machine running. When the ship finally docked at the end of the voyage, most of the crew couldn't get off fast enough. But Fabian stayed. He had Karina's parents' contact info. He felt a duty, a need to tell them that their daughter was a real person, not a press release. He met them in a quiet hotel lobby. Karina's mother was older, a kind woman with her daughter's tired eyes. Her father was a quiet, broken man. They weren't corporate fighters. They were just parents who had lost their child. And in that moment, Fabian made a choice. He couldn't just walk away. He became their link, their translator. On his off days, he'd sit at their small kitchen table, helping Karina's mother sort through the emails from the cruise line. He would read the cold, polite, almost automated legal language and try to explain what it meant. He helped them find a lawyer. He sat with them through phone calls that went unanswered and meetings that were endlessly postponed. He became part of their fight, a fight against a wall of corporate silence. It was a systematic dismantling of their trust in any authority, a descent into a new kind of horror made of bureaucracy and indifference. The independent coroner's report was a strange day. Fabian was there when they got the news. For a moment, there was relief. A small piece of the truth had been won, but it was followed almost immediately by a deeper, colder despair. The report validated their horror without providing any answers. It left them with nothing to hold on to. No cause, no explanation, and no Karina. The experience left a permanent psychological scar, a truth with no resolution. Fabian still works out there. It's a job. But the silence is different now. The ship never feels safe. The story isn't just his anymore. It's a weight he shares with two grieving parents. It's the empty chair across from him in the crew mess, and it's the empty room in a quiet house miles from the sea. The question that stays with him, the one that keeps him awake when the silence gets too loud, is, where does a person go when they just walk away? And Fabian's fear is not unfounded. The story of Carena is not an isolated incident. Since the year 2000, it's estimated that over 200 passengers and crew have gone missing from cruise ships worldwide. Some maritime organizations put that number closer to 400. That's an average of 10 to 25 people who vanish from ships every single year. The chances of surviving are incredibly low. In the years leading up to Carena's disappearance, from 2000 to 2013, only 1 in 5 people who went overboard were ever rescued. The true numbers are likely much higher, as reporting has historically been inconsistent. The cold, hard truth is that the vast majority of these disappearances are not accidents. Most are classified as suspicious, and in almost every case, the victim's body is never recovered. This lack of a final answer is what makes these cases so terrifying for those involved. Carena's story is not a solitary ghost story. It is just one of hundreds, a chilling reminder that some truths are simply left to drift, lost at sea.